Yes, I'm the focal point on aging in Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Division for Social Policy and Development. And what that means is I'm the focal point for the UN system on issues of aging. We are responsible for the follow-up of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, and in fact we were involved in facilitating the negotiations when we drafted the Madrid Plan of Action. And in our role as focal point, we are the ones that are responsible for reporting to the General Assembly and ECOSOC and any other UN intergovernmental bodies within the Secretariat on progress or any other issues, including human rights of older persons. So that's what we do. We also help in provision of technical assistance to member states, developing countries in the development of policies and programs on aging. Well, we've had a long relationship with AARP at the United Nations, but in recent years AARP has started to do more with their international side of their organization. About 6 years ago, they started this joint AARP UN briefing series, which is held during the Commission for Social Development, where we discuss aging issues. And it's a 2-day event, and we collaborate in the AARP organizes the speakers for the first day, and on the second day, the Focal Point on Aging office, we get to have free rein to focus on particular issues at the UN that we want to highlight as well. So it is a very close collaboration in this particular event. It's an important event because it gets a cross-section of delegates and delegates who are attending from capitals as well, the NGO sector, but also the private sector. And it also draws in people that maybe are not that familiar with aging issues. So I think it's also part of an educational event, an exchange. Why should we care about it? Well, it was adopted by member states in 2002, and in fact there was a first international plan. That was the second international plan. There was one from Vienna in 1982, and about 5 years before we had the second World Assembly on Aging, the member states, and particularly those in developing countries, felt that the Vienna Plan of Action from 1982, it was drafted back, well, if you look at 1982, it was back in the day where really the only issue of demographic aging was mostly in developed countries. And so many of the recommendations and the slant of the narrative was more aimed towards developed countries. As we started to see more developing countries aging, they felt that the plan needed to be redone to take into account a new way of looking at aging, but also their concerns with aging. So that's how we came to have a second World Assembly in 2002. Why we should care about, well, I guess the question is who should care about? Certainly governments should care about it. And the focus of the Madrid Plan of Action is very much on the developmental aspects of aging rather than a welfare approach to aging. So we're not just talking about, obviously it does talk about issues of pensions and these kinds of things, but it talks more in terms of how older persons can contribute to the development of their countries, and not so much on what older persons need, because it's a fine balance between older people who get to advanced age who need support, but when the majority of older persons are not there, they're still very much contributing members of society. So I think the Madrid Plan of Action, it manages to balance both the needs for those who need it, but also how older people can keep contributing. The Millennium Development Goals were adopted by member states in 2000, and the deadline for meeting Millennium Development Goals are 2015. Basically, they were a set of a limited number of goals that member states, particularly in developing countries, could all agree upon and work towards. And so they were a limited number of targets. and many of them were wrapped around poverty reduction targets, maternal health mortality, these kinds of, education of children that had very achievable goals and were able to be measured. And on a global level, particularly in developing countries, they were very successful for coalescing governments and people around meeting these targets. So as we approach 2015, now governments are talking about, well, where do we go from here? Because they were successful, but then by the same token, people have begun to realize that those were very narrow targets, and that the dialogue needs to be expanded. Post Rio, which was about environment that happened in Brazil last year, they're now merging sustainable development targets and what were MDG targets. So we're now looking at a situation where we have environmental, a social pillar, economics, and so it's a very complicated but interesting process that's merging those issues. And so the importance for us and the importance for aging, but also other social issues, is that the social pillar side of that remains strong and becomes merged with those other equally important pillars. So we're talking now about sustainable, economic, environmental and social issues. So it's quite a complicated process, but I think hopefully it should be a more encompassing process with many more wider targets and indicators to measure those things going forward. The post-2015 debate, as we know, is ongoing right now, and there are many groups who are advocating that their particular issues should be included in the post-2015. I think the general approach that we're taking with the aging community is an age-inclusive approach. What we don't want to see happen is that there's a residual approach to aging, and that maybe we'll get something in there about pensions, because as we've just talked about, older persons, does not boil down to receipt of a pension. There's so many other things. So I think the approach has to be that we mainstream the issue of age inclusiveness across the life course into all the targets and all the whatever agreements materialize. At the moment it's too soon to say, but the UN and member states very much like they did with the MDGs get behind these targets and agreements, and that's how they formulate programs and policies. So it's crucial, which did not happen with the MDGs, unfortunately, that older people and age inclusiveness and aging gets in a very positive developmental way in order for us to be part of the dialogue and part of the action in all member states when it comes to population aging and older people.